I never imagined a single moment could unravel my life so completely. One minute, I was driving home from the grocery store trying to soothe my twins, Lila and Ethan, who were wailing after spilling juice on the living room carpet. I was exhausted, stressed, and barely holding it together. But there was a fragile thread of hope running through me. Maybe, just maybe, we could make it through the day without another disaster. Then everything shattered. The sound of screeching tires, the crunch of metal, the sharp shatter of glass, it all happened too fast. I remember the force of the collision pressing me into the seatbelt, the smell of burning rubber, the screaming of my children, and the sudden, sharp pain in my side that made me gasp. My body refused to obey me. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even scream. The world became a blur of light, sound, and unbearable pain. When the paramedics arrived, I barely had the strength to explain what happened. Lila and Ethan were crying in the back seat, terrified, and I was certain they would remember this moment forever. My thoughts were consumed by only one thing: they had to be safe. Hours later, I was in the emergency room, hooked up to monitors. IV lines running through my arms, the smell of antiseptic filling the air. The pain in my abdomen was almost unbearable, and I could feel my body trembling from shock. The nurses moved quickly, their faces calm and professional, but I barely registered them. My focus was on the twins. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called my parents. This was not the first time I had needed them, but it was the first time I had felt utterly desperate. I explained the accident, my voice tight and trembling, begging them to come watch Lila and Ethan for a few hours. I needed them. I was bleeding, scared, and alone. Their response has been etched into my memory forever. "You've always been a burden. We have Taylor Swift tickets with your sister tonight." The line went dead. Silence. I could not breathe. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I felt the air leave my lungs entirely. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. But more than anything, I felt a cold, crushing weight of betrayal. I had spent my life giving to them quietly, generously, without complaint. For 8 years, I had sent $3,200 every month, supporting their mortgage, paying their bills, and covering their health insurance. I had sacrificed sleep, peace, and sanity so they could live comfortably. Yet here I was, lying in a hospital bed bleeding from a car accident, and they dismissed me as if I were nothing. I could hear the distant laughter of other families, the sound of children playing in the waiting area, and I felt a rage so deep I could barely recognize it. I wasn't weak. I wasn't a burden. I had carried them my whole life, and yet, in the one moment I truly needed help, they abandoned me. Tears filled my eyes, hot and relentless. But beneath them, something shifted. It was as if a switch had flipped inside me. The anger, the pain, the humiliation, they all coalesced into a quiet, burning determination. I would survive this. I would protect my twins. And I would no longer allow myself to be taken for granted by the very people who claimed to love me. The nurses checked my vitals, their voices gentle. "You're going to be okay," one said. But I didn't hear her words. I was thinking about Lila and Ethan, alone, terrified, and helpless. I was thinking about all the nights I had spent worrying about my parents, hoping they would appreciate me, hoping they would care. I realized then, with a clarity that scared me, that I had been invisible to them for a long time. They never saw me, never valued me, never treated me like the person I was. I thought about the $3,200 I had sent them each month. Money that kept their lives comfortable while I struggled to cover diapers, groceries, and bills for my twins. Money that had been taken for granted, assumed, expected. Money that would no longer flow to people who had chosen a concert over the lives of my children and me. And I made a decision that would change everything. When the surgeon arrived to discuss my internal bleeding and the need for immediate surgery, I nodded mechanically. I would fight for my life, yes, but I would also fight for my dignity. I would no longer let my parents dictate my worth through their selfishness. Every dollar, every sacrifice, every ounce of energy I had given would now be mine to reclaim. As I lay there, waiting for the surgery. I thought about the twins' small faces, the way Ethan's tiny hand had gripped mine moments before the crash. The way Lila had clung to the backseat headrest, crying and terrified. My heart ached, but I also felt a growing sense of power. I could not change the past, but I could take control of my future. The hours stretched endlessly. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain in my abdomen constant and gnawing. Every beep of the monitor, every shuffle of the nurses reminded me that I was alive. And that survival was not enough. I wanted justice. Not revenge, exactly, but recognition. I wanted to set boundaries that had never existed. I wanted to reclaim my life from people who had taken it for granted. By the time my surgery began, I had made a full plan in my mind. The $3,200 monthly payments would stop. No more mortgage payments. No more health insurance. No more financial servitude to people who had refused to see me as human. I would not tell them yet, there was no need. The moment of revelation would be theirs to experience later, when they finally understood that I had limits. Recovery was painful, slower than I anticipated. The twins visited with a relative I could trust, a neighbor who had been helping me quietly for years. Each time I saw their small faces, their tiny hands reaching for me, it reinforced my resolve. I was doing this for them, and for me. I had to survive, yes, but I also had to take a stand. During the quiet moments, lying in the hospital bed with my body aching and the room silent except for the faint hum of machines, I reflected on my life. I thought about every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night, every dollar sent to parents who never once thanked me. I realized that I had been living to meet their expectations for far too long. They had dictated my value, and in doing so, had diminished me in my own eyes. But not anymore. I allowed myself to feel the rage fully, to let it flow through me without guilt. I allowed myself to imagine the moment when they would finally learn that I would no longer be manipulated. And even in my pain, even while weak from surgery and blood loss, I felt a sense of freedom I had never known. It wasn't just about money, it was about self-respect, about recognizing my own worth, about teaching my children, even at their young age, that no one should ever be allowed to make them feel less than they are. I would show them, through my actions, that standing up for yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. Weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits, recovery, and quiet reflection. The pain in my body began to ease, but the emotional wound remained raw. I remembered the look on my twins' faces during the accident, the helplessness in their cries, and the betrayal in my parents' voices. And I knew that the path forward would not be easy. But I also knew it was mine to walk, and for the first time I felt ready. When I finally returned home, the house felt different. The twins ran to me, laughing and crying all at once, and I held them tightly, savoring every moment. The small, ordinary sounds of life, their laughter, the squeak of toys, the soft breathing of children asleep, reminded me what truly mattered. Not the approval of my parents, not the money I had sent them, not their validation. What mattered was life and love and dignity, and somewhere deep inside I felt a quiet, determined anticipation. The next steps would involve more than just recovery. They would involve truth, boundaries, and justice. My parents had underestimated me. They had assumed I would remain the obedient, generous child they had always taken for granted. But I was no longer that person. I had survived the accident, reclaimed my strength, and I had a plan, one that would ensure they never saw me as a burden again. For now, though, I let myself simply breathe, to revel in the love of my children, to feel the pain and the triumph all at once. I was bleeding, battered, and betrayed, but I was alive. And being alive meant I had the power to change everything. The accident had taken much from me, but it had also given me clarity. I would no longer allow my life, my money, or my love to be exploited. I would protect my children at all costs. And when the time came, they would all see. The person they called a burden was the one who had quietly carried them for years. And now, for the first time, I would stand strong for myself. The first few days at home after leaving the hospital were both a relief and a torment. Relief, because I was finally away from the sterile, bright lights, the constant beeping of machines, the smell of antiseptic, and the constant rush of strangers. Voices, but torment, because the silence of my house made the absence of my parents echo louder than ever. Their words, cold and dismissive, reverberated in my mind. You've always been a burden. We have Taylor Swift tickets with your sister tonight. Even with the twins laughing around me, tugging at my arms and climbing over my lap, I felt the sting of their rejection deep in my bones. Lila's small hand would occasionally squeeze mine, and Ethan would try to imitate his sister, rubbing my arm gently as if sensing the weight of my sorrow. They didn't know why I was crying, and I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I explain that the people who were supposed to care about me, my own parents, had chosen a concert over my life? Over the safety of their own grandchildren? I spent hours staring at the bills that had piled up while I was in the hospital, trying to focus on numbers instead of the raw emotional wound that throbbed with every heartbeat. Then it hit me like a ton of bricks. For 8 years, I had been sending $3,200 every month to my parents, quietly covering their mortgage, insurance, and bills, all while struggling to make ends meet for my twins and myself. Every month, without fail, I had sacrificed for them, believing in the idea of family, believing that my parents cared even a little, and now I realized the truth. They didn't. They never had. They had taken me for granted, used my generosity as a crutch, and called me a burden the moment I was weakest. The betrayal burned hotter than any pain from the accident. I began writing everything down in a notebook I kept hidden in my bedside drawer. Each entry was a mixture of fear, anger, and clarity. I documented every sacrifice, every dollar sent, every time I had bent over backward to support them, and every insult, every dismissal I had endured. The act of writing it all gave me a strange kind of power, a record that no one could deny. Not even myself. By the third day at home, I had made a concrete decision. The $3,200 monthly support would stop immediately. No more mortgage payments. No more insurance. No more giving them the lifeline they had used as a leash. I didn't need to confront them just yet. They didn't deserve the satisfaction of knowing I was taking control. It would be more powerful to let them assume everything was normal until the truth hit them, hard and undeniable. In the mornings, after the twins were settled with breakfast and their small routines, I found moments of quiet reflection. I realized that their betrayal wasn't just about the accident or the money. It was about a lifetime of being invisible, being taken for granted, being treated like I existed only to serve them. Every memory I had of my parents from childhood to adulthood now carried a dual weight, the nostalgia of love and the bitter knowledge of exploitation. But just as clarity and resolve were taking root, something unexpected began to shift the dynamic quietly. My grandfather. He was an unassuming presence in the family, quiet, gentle, and observant. Unlike my parents, he never demanded, never criticized, never made me feel small. But he had always been aware of how my parents treated me, aware of my sacrifices, aware of the invisible burden I carried. And now, in the wake of my accident, his attention was subtle but unmistakable. He called almost every evening, not asking questions, not demanding details, but simply checking in, listening. "How are you feeling today?" he would ask softly. Not "how are the bills?" Not "how are your parents reacting?" Just me. And in his calm, quiet presence, I felt a small but steady sense of support, the kind I hadn't known I craved. It was during one of these calls, while the twins napped in the other room, that he said something that would stick with me. "You've always carried more than your share. It's time you let them carry themselves for a change." His words weren't angry or dramatic. They didn't need to be. They were simple, precise, and full of gravity. I realized that he saw everything. He knew what my parents had done, and he understood that this wasn't just a moment of betrayal. It was a pattern. And more importantly, he seemed to know that I was ready to reclaim my life. As the days passed, I began to notice small signs that my parents assumed nothing had changed. They called occasionally, more out of routine than concern. "How are the kids?" they asked, voice light, avoiding any acknowledgement of the accident. They never asked how I was, never offered to help. And each time my resolve strengthened. I would no longer be the invisible caretaker of their comfort. My support, once taken for granted, would now be gone, and they would feel the absence sharply. Managing the twins was exhausting. Lila and Ethan required constant attention, and I was still recovering from internal bleeding and surgery. But every small moment I spent caring for them, reading them stories, watching them laugh, reinforced the truth that my energy and love were worth more than I had ever allowed myself to acknowledge. I realized that my parents' indifference could not diminish the life I was building with my own children. Financially, I began the process of cutting off the support. It was a strange feeling, relief mixed with a tiny spark of fear. After 8 years of sending thousands each month, suddenly stopping felt like removing a leash I had never realized I had been wearing. But I reminded myself constantly, this wasn't punishment. It was boundaries. It was self-respect. It was teaching my children, even at their young age, that their well-being mattered above anyone else's convenience. And then came the call I had anticipated but never quite expected. My grandfather. "Mark your calendar," he said, voice calm but firm. "I'm having my 70th birthday soon. I would like you there. And I think it's time your parents hear some truths." I froze. The idea of facing my parents, of seeing their faces after everything, made my stomach churn. But at the same time, a flicker of hope ignited. Finally, someone who understood. Finally, someone who would act as a witness to the truth. Finally, someone who could provide a stage for justice without cruelty. Over the next week, I began preparing myself, not just emotionally, but mentally. I reviewed every moment of betrayal, every dollar sent, every insult and dismissive word. I rehearsed how I would feel, how I would stand, how I would maintain my composure. My parents would not manipulate me. This time, I would remain in control. The twins noticed my more serious demeanor, though they couldn't understand the gravity of the situation. I explained to them in the simplest terms that sometimes adults make mistakes, but that we always protect ourselves and each other. I wanted them to witness strength, even in moments of anger and hurt, because I knew they would need to understand boundaries in their own lives. The day of the birthday party arrived. It wasn't time for confrontation yet, but my grandfather had set the stage. Invitations had been sent to the family, including my parents. They arrived, laughing and oblivious, certain that everything was as it had always been. I watched from a quiet corner, my twins safely at home with a trusted caregiver as they mingled, unaware of the storm gathering quietly beneath the surface. Grandpa was calm, almost serene, moving through the room, greeting family members with warmth. But there was an undercurrent, a subtle tension that seemed to radiate from him, a signal that something was about to shift. I could see my parents enjoying themselves, thinking they were untouchable, thinking their choices would go unchallenged, and yet I felt a quiet power. I had survived the accident, reclaimed my financial control, and was mentally prepared for whatever was about to unfold. My grandfather's presence was a shield, a silent promise that the truth would finally emerge without me having to fight alone. During the evening, he casually mentioned my accident in conversation with a few distant relatives, noting the twins' well-being and the choice my parents had made. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. But the words were precise, revealing the truth with a calm authority that left no room for denial. I watched my parents' faces as the reality sank in. There was a flicker of guilt, quickly suppressed, a flash of panic, and then an awkward silence that grew heavier by the minute. For years they had assumed they could manipulate, ignore, and dismiss me. But now, in the presence of family, the power had shifted. The quiet, steady voice of my grandfather, the calm truth of their neglect, and the absence of my habitual compliance left them exposed, and it was the first time I truly felt uncheckable. I was no longer a burden, no longer invisible, no longer a source of exploitation. I had survived trauma, taken control of my life, and reclaimed my dignity. And I knew deep in my bones that this was only the beginning of setting the boundaries I had always deserved. That night, as I returned home, the quiet hum of the house felt different. The twins were asleep and I allowed myself a moment to rest, to breathe, and to feel the enormity of what had shifted. My parents had underestimated me for too long. But now, I had survived, reclaimed, and prepared myself for the ultimate confrontation. The accident had been devastating, the betrayal unbearable, but it had also opened a door. And I was ready to walk through it, strong, steady, and unafraid. The week leading up to my grandfather's 70th birthday felt like walking a tightrope. Each morning, I woke with a mixture of dread and determination, carrying the weight of what was to come. On one hand, I had survived the accident and taken back control of my finances. On the other, I was about to step into a room filled with people who had hurt me for years, and their faces would be the first to confront the truth I had long withheld. I spent mornings with Lila and Ethan, trying to maintain our fragile routines, the chaos of breakfast, spilled juice, and laughter grounding me. But underneath it all, my mind raced. I rehearsed conversations in my head. I imagined their faces when Grandpa would casually, calmly expose their selfishness in front of the family. I imagined the shock, the shame, the sudden realization that their careless actions had consequences. And a quiet satisfaction settled deep within me, a sense that justice was coming, not through anger, not through confrontation, but simply through the truth. Grandpa called me daily now, not to instruct, but to remind me that strength came from patience. "You don't have to speak loudly," he said one evening, his voice steady, almost a whisper through the phone. "Sometimes, the truth speaks for itself, and those who know what they've done will feel it in the silence." I clung to his words like a lifeline. I had been raised believing that confrontation required anger and shouting, but Grandpa's wisdom taught me otherwise. Calm, unwavering presence, paired with unassailable truth, was infinitely more powerful. On the morning of the party, I woke early, preparing myself not physically, though the twins would be cared for, but emotionally. I sat in the quiet of my living room, alone, sipping tea, reflecting on every insult, every dismissal, every time I had been treated as a burden. I recalled lying in the hospital bed, tubes in my arms, unable to breathe from pain and shock, and I remembered my parents' dismissive words. "You've always been a burden. We have Taylor Swift tickets with your sister tonight." The memory stung sharply, but it no longer weakened me. By the time I arrived at the venue, I felt a strange combination of calm and readiness. The decorations were simple, family photographs hung on the walls, and the hum of conversation filled the air. My parents arrived shortly after, laughing lightly, arms intertwined, clearly in their own world, completely unaware of the tension quietly swelling around them. They didn't know the plan. They didn't know the truth that Grandpa had carefully positioned to reveal in the most effective way. Grandpa greeted me first, his hand warm and reassuring. "Are you ready?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet intensity that left no doubt. He had orchestrated everything, and I simply needed to be present. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And I was ready. We moved into the main room where family members were gathered. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and distant relatives mingled, laughing and sharing stories, unaware of the storm about to quietly unfold. My parents in particular seemed at ease, convinced that this birthday would be just another celebration, oblivious to the subtle undercurrents they had ignored for years. Grandpa began with casual conversations, asking about work, health, and distant family members. His tone was calm, unhurried, but his eyes betrayed a careful scrutiny. He was observing, noting, and preparing. Then, seamlessly, he shifted the topic. "You know," he said, his voice soft, drawing the attention of nearby relatives, "sometimes we underestimate people in our lives. We assume their generosity, their love, and their sacrifices are infinite." He paused, letting the words sink in. I watched my parents' faces shift almost imperceptibly. A flicker of confusion, a tightening of lips, A subtle glance exchanged. They were unaware that Grandpa's words were carefully chosen for them, and that the entire room was about to bear witness to truths they had long ignored. He continued, his tone deliberate, steady. 8 years ago, one of my grandchildren began quietly supporting others, helping, sacrificing, giving. Every month, thousands of dollars, without complaint, without recognition. And yet, when the time came for support, for care when it was needed most, he let the words hang heavy, filling the room with tension. My parents shifted in their seats, their light laughter from moments before evaporating. They didn't yet know who Grandpa was speaking about, but instinctively, they felt the weight. A sense of unease crept over them, subtle at first, but undeniable. Grandpa's voice grew calm, yet sharp, precise. When an accident happened, when life was on the line, this grandchild reached out, hoping for assistance. And the response received? Dismissal, indifference, choosing entertainment over family. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. The power was in the quiet truth, laid bare for all to see. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. I could see the ripple effect of each word. Cousins whispered, aunts glanced at one another, and my parents' eyes widened. The room had shifted from casual celebration to subtle confrontation. Grandpa had struck without raising his voice, yet his words carried a weight they could not ignore. Then he looked directly at my parents. Some of us are generous without expecting thanks. Some of us give without anyone noticing. And some are taken for granted, dismissed, and overlooked, despite doing everything they can to support those they love. The silence was deafening. My parents' faces flushed, a mixture of guilt, anger, and shock. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Their assumptions about control, about manipulation, about their child's quiet compliance had been dismantled. In a matter of moments, I stayed in the background, calm, composed, but internally my heart raced. This was not revenge. This was simply truth exposed, and the consequences were theirs to bear. I had prepared for this for weeks, and now the room bore witness to the reality of their choices. Grandpa continued, his eyes gentle but unwavering. It's easy to dismiss someone as a burden. It's harder to acknowledge the weight they carry. For you, today, I hope everyone sees the value of integrity, of generosity, and of respect. As he spoke, I noticed subtle shifts in other family members. Some looked at my parents with newfound awareness, some at me with quiet admiration. The room's energy changed. What had been a casual birthday gathering had transformed into a moment of reckoning. My parents tried to speak, fumbling, attempting explanations. But Grandpa's calm presence made interruption impossible. Every word they tried to offer sounded weak, insincere, inadequate. They realized painfully that their choices had consequences. They had underestimated me, overlooked my sacrifices, and dismissed my worth. Now the truth was undeniable, laid bare before everyone they knew. After a moment, Grandpa concluded, "We are all capable of giving, of caring, of supporting. But it requires awareness, attention, and gratitude. And sometimes we must see the consequences of neglect to truly understand the impact of our actions." The words settled in the room like a weight. My parents sat, speechless, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from malice, but from justice. Their neglect, their selfishness, their indifference, they had all been exposed without a single raised voice or argument. The calm certainty of truth had done what anger could not. Later, as family members mingled and discussed the subtle tension, I remained on the sidelines, observing, absorbing. The twins were still at home, safe, unaware of the adult drama, and I felt a deep sense of peace. I had survived trauma, reclaimed my dignity, and set the stage for boundaries that would last a lifetime. That night, returning home, the silence of my house felt different. It wasn't empty or lonely. It was quiet with possibility. I had confronted betrayal not through anger, but through truth, and the results were undeniable. My parents could no longer manipulate me. They could no longer claim ignorance. They had been witnessed. And most importantly, I had witnessed myself, realizing my strength, resilience, and capacity to protect what truly mattered: my children, my boundaries, and my dignity. Grandpa's quiet guidance, his subtle orchestration had ensured that the exposure was complete, measured, and irreversible. I was not a burden. I was not invisible. I was a parent, a survivor, and a person who would no longer allow exploitation disguised as family to dictate the terms of my life. That night, I allowed myself to rest fully, knowing that the final part of this journey, the aftermath, the healing, and the new life with clear boundaries would be next. But for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. I had survived, I had reclaimed, and I had been witnessed. And that was everything. The morning of my grandfather's 70th birthday felt heavy, charged with an energy I could neither name nor escape. I was no longer bleeding, no longer weak from surgery, but the nerves were sharp, a deep thrum beneath my chest that I could feel in every step. This wasn't just a family gathering. It was the moment the truth would finally confront the people who had spent years taking me for granted. I dressed with care, not for anyone else, but to feel steady in my own skin. My twins were safe at home with a trusted caregiver, their laughter echoing in my memory and giving me strength. I whispered to myself, this wasn't about revenge or shame, it was about truth, boundaries, and recognition. After everything, it was my turn to be seen. When we arrived, the room was alive with the casual bustle of celebration, the soft rustle of decorations, muted conversations, and the faint sound of music in the background. My parents were already there, smiling, radiating a confidence that assumed all was normal. They were blissfully unaware that the calm I carried, and the quiet intensity in my grandfather's eyes, meant the evening would unfold differently than they expected. Grandpa greeted me first, his hand warm and firm, his eyes carrying that unshakable steadiness I had come to trust. Are you ready? He asked softly. I nodded, feeling a mix of apprehension and quiet power. This moment had been carefully orchestrated. The room, the people, the timing, all to ensure that the truth could be revealed without me ever raising my voice in anger. We entered together. My parents' initial brightness at seeing me faltered almost immediately, though they did not understand why. The tension was subtle but present, a current they had never noticed before, a signal that the balance of control had shifted. Grandpa's presence was calm, but unmistakably deliberate. Every glance, every measured step, seemed to signal to the room that something significant was about to occur. He began casually, greeting family members, exchanging pleasantries. His voice was gentle, calm, but every word carried an underlying gravity. You know, he began, we often take the people closest to us for granted. We assume their sacrifices, their patience, and their love are endless. My parents shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible signs of unease flickering across their faces. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. The calm clarity of his words carried their own force. The room had fallen into a quiet tension. And sometimes, he continued, we overlook those who carry more than their share. We dismiss their struggles, ignore their pain, and fail to acknowledge their efforts. He paused, letting the silence stretch, and I could see the realization begin to settle, slow but undeniable, in my parents' expressions. Then he looked directly at them. 8 years ago, one of my grandchildren quietly began supporting others, covering bills, mortgages, health insurance, giving thousands each month without complaint. And yet, when life demanded help, when an emergency arose, what was the response? The room seemed to shrink. All conversation, all laughter, all background noise faded to a tense, watchful quiet. Dismissal, Grandpa said softly, the word cutting through the room with precision. Indifference. Choosing entertainment over family. Over the very people who depended on you. My parents froze. Their lips parted, words forming that never quite came out. Their smug assurance had evaporated under the weight of truth. For years they had assumed control, assumed compliance, assumed that I would remain invisible. that my sacrifices would be taken for granted. But now the balance had shifted. Grandpa's calm, deliberate words exposed the reality they had ignored. For decades, I watched them, my chest tight with a mix of lingering fear and rising strength. The room was silent but alive with tension. Cousins exchanged glances. Aunts whispered softly. Even the youngest relatives seemed to sense that something monumental was happening. Grandpa continued, now speaking directly to the gathered family. It's easy to dismiss someone as a burden. It's harder to acknowledge the weight they carry silently, day after day. And sometimes we must see the consequences of neglect to truly understand the impact of our choices. I felt my heartbeat steady as I watched my parents' faces. Guilt, shame, anger, and disbelief flickered across their expressions. They had never expected this. They had never imagined that quiet observation, subtle words, and undeniable facts could leave them exposed in front of everyone they knew. I've witnessed this grandchild's sacrifices for years. Grandpa. Son, his voice calm but firm. And when the accident happened, when life was on the line, there was a cry for help. And the response? He let the silence stretch. Refusal, indifference, choosing personal comfort over the lives of grandchildren. And the one who cared for them. At that moment, I could see their panic. Their laughter, their smug confidence, their casual dismissals all stripped away by the weight of truth. The entire family was watching. The words had done their work without raising a voice, without anger, without shame on my part. The only response necessary was the undeniable clarity of reality. Then, quietly, I stepped forward. Not to accuse, not to shout, but to be present. Grandpa had done the work. I only needed to exist as a witness, a living reminder of their neglect and my perseverance. I met my parents' eyes, calm, steady, resolute. I no longer needed their validation. I no longer needed them to see me as anything less than I was. A survivor, a parent, a person of value who would no longer allow themselves to be exploited. A ripple moved through the room. Some cousins whispered among themselves. Some relatives glanced at my parents with shock, some with quiet understanding. The power of truth laid bare was unlike anything anger could achieve. Grandpa's final words rang clear. We are all capable of giving, of supporting, of loving. But it requires awareness, gratitude, and respect. And sometimes seeing the consequences of neglect is the only way to truly understand the weight of our actions. My parents sat silently, speechless. Their previous confidence had dissolved completely. They had underestimated me, disregarded me and dismissed me, but now the truth was undeniable. They could no longer manipulate, deny, or ignore. The silent, unwavering power of reality had done what years of pleading could not. I left the room shortly after, walking away from the party, leaving my parents to their shame and the quiet whispers of family members who now saw the truth. Outside, the cool evening air washed over me, and I finally allowed myself to breathe fully. The burden of years had been lifted. I had survived, reclaimed my dignity, and established boundaries that would never again be crossed. Returning home, the twins were asleep, their small bodies curled into blankets, unaware of the emotional storm that had unfolded but feeling the calm and safety of our home. I held them close, whispering that they were safe, that I loved them, and that no one could ever take them for granted. In their sleep, I felt a profound sense of relief and completeness. The journey had been painful. The betrayal had cut deep. But the clarity, the boundaries, the quiet triumph of truth, these were more powerful than any revenge could ever be. I had survived trauma, exposed indifference, and reclaimed my life. My children were safe, my dignity restored, and my family, finally, had to reckon with the truth. That night I slept fully, unburdened, knowing that the accident, the betrayal, and the long years of exploitation had all led to a single moment of recognition. I had survived. I had been seen. And I had finally proven to myself, to my children, and to my parents that no one could take my worth for granted ever again. This story is a reminder. Your boundaries, your dignity, and your voice matter. If you've ever had to stand up for yourself, Comment I am stronger below. Like and subscribe to hear more stories of courage and family truths.